Wyoming Territory, autumn of 1879, the cold came early that year. The wind moved through the pines like it was hunting something, and the ground was already hard where frost had crept in during the night. Garrett Lorne spotted the buzzards first. He reined in his horse, Boone, narrowing his eyes at the dark shapes circling low ahead. That was not a good sign. He nudged Boone forward, his rifle slung across his back, the brim of his hat low over his brow. A few yards in, just off a deer trail, he saw her. She was crumpled under a pine, her dress torn and dirty, one boot missing. Blood had dried along her hairline, and her skin was pale as bone. Garrett's heart thudded hard in his chest. He swung down from Boone, crouched beside her, and reached for her wrist. Then he saw her fingers move. "Hey, hey, do not move too much," he said quickly, more breath than voice, her eyes fluttered. She winced, her lips parting like she wanted to say something, but all that came out was a dry rasp. Garrett pulled his canteen free and uncorked it. "Here," he said, lifting her head gently, tipping the water to her mouth. She swallowed, weak and slow. "What is your name?" he asked, brushing dirt from her cheek. She blinked hard. "Adele," she whispered. "Adele Prescott." Garrett nodded, his throat tight. "All right, Adele, I am Garrett." "I am going to get you out of here." Her eyes started closing again. "No, wait, my brother," she said, voice trembling. "He left me here, said I was slowing him down." Garrett's jaw clenched. "When yesterday," she whispered, "he hit me, took my mare. Said if I made it out, I deserved to live." Garrett kept his hand steady on her shoulder, though every muscle in him had gone rigid. "You are safe now, I will take care of you." She tried to shake her head. "You do not even know me." "Do not need to," he said, already pulling his coat off and wrapping it around her. "You are not dying in these woods." He got her onto Boone, holding her upright in the saddle while he walked beside them. The closest town was over 12 miles back, but he knew an old trapper's cabin about half that distance. He aimed for that. By dusk, the cabin came into view, half sunk into the hill, door hanging crooked, but solid enough to keep the wind out. He kicked it open, got a fire going fast, and laid Adele down on a pile of old pelts near the hearth. She was half unconscious by then, feverish and shaking. Garrett cleaned the cut on her head, boiled water, and ground up willow bark for the pain. She murmured his name once, barely audible. He watched her through the night, adding wood to the fire, checking her breathing. She looked so small curled up there, her face drawn and pale. The thought of her brother walking away from her like that made Garrett's stomach twist. When morning came, she was still alive. Better, even. Color had returned to her cheeks. "Is this your place?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "No, just a spot I know," she blinked. "Why did you help me?" He sat beside her, pulled his hat off, and ran a hand through his hair. "You were alone and hurt." That was enough. Adele stared at him for a long moment. Most men would have ridden past. "Well," he said, "I am not most men." A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. "No, I do not think you are." They stayed in the cabin for 3 days. Adele was too weak to travel, and Garrett would not risk moving her until he was sure she would hold steady. He hunted a rabbit, cooked it with salt he had in his saddlebag, and gave her the better pieces. She watched him as he worked, her eyes quiet, thoughtful. "You do not talk much," she said on the second night. "Do not have much worth saying," he replied. "I think that is not true." He glanced over at her then, and she met his gaze head-on. Something passed between them that neither of them said out loud, not yet. But it was there, steady and sure as the firelight dancing between them. On the 4th morning she stood on her own. Wobbly but standing. "I want to go back to town," she said. "To Pine Hollow." Garrett nodded. "All right." They rode slow. She leaned against him in the saddle, her fingers curled lightly in the front of his coat. Garrett kept one hand over hers. In town, folks stared when they came in. Adele's dress was still torn, her face bruised, but she held her chin high. Garrett dismounted, helped her down, and walked her straight to the marshal's office. Inside, Adele told the truth. "His name is Walter Prescott," she said, voice steady. "My brother. We were traveling to Idaho, but he got spooked when we ran low on supplies, said I was too much trouble. Left me for dead." The marshal, a gruff man named Harlan, listened close. "We will put out word," he said. "You got somewhere to stay?" Adele hesitated. Garrett stepped forward. "She is staying with me." Harlan looked between them, then nodded once. "All right, I will send a rider west." If your brother shows his face again, we will deal with him. Garrett brought her back to his small ranch house just outside town. It was nothing fancy, a one-room cabin with a stone hearth and a porch that looked out over the hills. But it was clean and warm and safe. That night, she stood at the window watching the moon rise. Garrett came up beside her. "You all right?" She nodded slowly. "You saved my life. You are the one who moved your hand," he said quietly. "You held on." Adele turned toward him then, and for the first time he saw tears in her eyes. "I did not think anyone was coming." "I was," he said. "I just did not know it yet." She reached out, her fingers brushing his. He took her hand, held it tight. Neither of them said anything else. They did not need to. Garrett had never been much for sharing space. The cabin was small, built with his own hands after years of drifting, and not meant for two. But Adele moved through it like she belonged, careful and quiet, folding her things into corners without asking for more room than she needed. She never complained about the cold draft under the door or the roof that creaked when the wind picked up. Instead, she asked where the water came from, and when he pointed toward the creek that ran behind the cottonwoods, she carried the bucket down herself, slow but stubborn. Garrett didn't argue. He knew better than to tell a woman like her she couldn't do something. One morning, while he was repairing the chicken coop, she stepped out with a handful of his shirts, freshly mended. "You've got a stitch missing on every cuff," she said, setting them down on the porch rail. "You sew like a man who's never been taught." "I haven't," he said, glancing up from the bent hinge he was hammering into place. She leaned against the post, arms crossed. "Then it's a wonder your coat held together long enough to reach me." He gave a quiet grunt of agreement and kept working, but her presence lingered even when she turned back inside. Something about her steadiness settled in his bones. That evening, after supper, she sat by the hearth with a pair of his socks in her lap, darning needle moving in tight, practiced strokes. "My mother taught me to sew before I could read," she said without looking up. Said it was the kind of skill a woman could carry anywhere. Garrett tilted his chair back slightly, letting the fire warm his boots. "Did she teach your brother too?" Adele's hands stilled. Walter never sat still long enough to learn anything that wasn't about getting his own way. The needle moved again, slower now. "He used to be kind when we were children, but after Pa died, something in him turned hard. He started seeing people as weights to carry or toss aside, and I didn't see it soon enough." Garrett didn't answer right away. The fire popped softly, sap hissing in the logs. "You're not the first to trust someone who didn't earn it." She glanced at him then, eyes catching the low light. "Did you?" He nodded once. "A man I rode with in Kansas. We worked cattle together, looked out for each other. Then one night he took every dollar we'd saved and the rancher's best horse. Left me with a broken rib and no name to give the sheriff." Her mouth tightened, but she didn't speak. "Men like that," Garrett said, "they walk away easy. But they leave a weight behind that don't lift quick." Adele folded the sock, set it aside. "I don't think I'll ever understand why Walter did it. Not really." "You don't have to understand it," Garrett said softly. "You just have to survive it." She looked down at her hands, then back at him. "I'd like to earn my keep if I'm staying here." "You already are," he said. She shook her head. "Not enough. I can cook, so help with the garden. If you've got something to trade, I could take a basket of eggs into town, maybe bring back what we need." Garrett studied her a moment. "You sure you're ready for that?" "I need to stop being afraid," she said. "I can't live looking over my shoulder." He nodded slowly. "All right, we'll try it." That week, she started rising before sunup, kneading dough while the sky was still pale. She kept a list in her apron pocket, scratching notes with a pencil worn down to the stub. Garrett watched her from the field sometimes, axe in hand, wondering how someone so hurt could move with such quiet resolve. When she returned from town the following Friday, cheeks flushed and a small sack of flour under her arm, she set it gently on the table and exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for miles. "No sign of him," she said. Garrett came in from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "You all right?" She nodded. "Mrs. Burney at the mercantile asked if I was your wife." He raised an eyebrow. "What you tell her?" I said I wasn't. He waited. "But I didn't say I wouldn't be." He stilled, the rag crumpling in his hand. "I'm not asking for anything," she said quickly. I needed you to know I'm not running anymore." Garrett stepped closer, the space between them narrowing like the breath before a storm breaks. I don't want you to be anyone but who you are. I'm still figuring that out, she whispered. I'll wait, he said. She reached for his hand then, her fingers rough from work, warm from the ride. He didn't speak, just folded his hand around hers and let the silence stretch, deep and steady. Outside, the wind had settled. The chickens clucked softly under the eaves. And inside the cabin, something unspoken took root between them, sturdy, growing slow but sure. The cottonwoods had gone yellow by the time Adele traded her first basket of eggs for a bolt of muslin and a tin of molasses. The days shortened with a quiet certainty, shadows falling earlier across the ridgeline each evening. Garrett added a second layer of chinking to the cabin's north wall, while Adele pressed apples into jars with cinnamon bark she'd bartered off a traveling peddler. One morning, she found a pair of worn riding gloves folded on the table beside her sewing kit. "These yours?" she asked as Garrett came in from the barn, his boots carrying the smell of fresh hay. "No," he said, brushing straw from his sleeves. "Figured your hands might need the protection come winter. You work harder than my mule." Adele turned them over in her hands. They looked like they belonged to someone. They did. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. Later that afternoon, she stitched a lining into the right glove, his old habit of tucking his thumb when he was thinking had worn the leather thin there. She left them back where she'd found them, without comment. That evening, Garrett returned from the hills with a fresh-cut deer slung over Boone's back. Adele met him in the yard, sleeves rolled, apron already dusted with flour. "I'll start the fire," she said. Garrett wiped his brow. "We'll hang what we don't eat." "Smoker should still hold." She nodded, then paused. "You ever think about leaving here?" "Sometimes," he said, "but I always stay." "Why?" He looked toward the west ridge. "I've seen enough of the world to know quiet's worth more than gold." Adele didn't answer right away. Her eyes tracked the trail beyond the fence, following its slow bend until it vanished into the trees. "I used to picture my life somewhere else," she said finally. "Back when I thought Walter was just restless, not cruel, I imagined we'd make it to Idaho, maybe open a dry goods store. I'd so he'd manage the ledgers." She shook her head, mouth tightening at the corners. "It sounds foolish now." "It's not foolish to hope," Garrett said. "It's only foolish to keep hoping when the truth's already shown itself." She looked at him then, her gaze steady. "And how do you tell the difference?" "You don't," he said. "You just wait long enough and the truth stops hiding." When the meat was packed and the bones buried out past the shed, Adele stepped onto the porch and leaned against the rail. Garrett stood beside her, arms crossed, watching the dark line where the trees met the sky. "You ever think someone else might come through here?" she asked. Meaning maybe Walter told someone where he was headed. "Or maybe he wants to make sure I didn't survive." Garrett's jaw tightened. "If he shows, he won't get past the gate." She didn't ask what he meant by that. The next morning, Garrett rode out early to check the fence along the southern boundary. Adele watched him go from the window, the curve of his back straight in the saddle, his coat pulled snug against the wind. She turned back inside and set about boiling water for laundry, but the rhythm of the day felt thinner without the quiet weight of his presence. By dusk, he hadn't returned. She lit a lantern and set it near the window, then pulled on her shawl. The horses were still in the barn, calm. No sign of trouble in the yard, but something in her chest ached with a familiar pull, the kind of hollow worry she hadn't felt since the day Walter left her under that pine. She didn't sleep, just waited, lantern flickering low until hoofbeats cracked through the quiet. Garrett stepped through the door just before sunrise, mud on his boots and a scrape across his cheekbone. "Fence was down," he said. "Wolf tracks near the creek. Got caught up chasing them off." She crossed the room and touched his face, thumb brushing the cut. "You should have sent Boone back if you were staying out. Didn't think it'd be all night. You were bleeding. It's nothing. You mean it's not mortal?" He gave a tired laugh, then winced. "That's about right." She poured water into a basin, dipped a cloth, and cleaned the dirt from his temple. He held still, eyes on her face. "You stayed up?" he asked. She nodded. "I wouldn't have left you wondering," he said. "I know," she whispered. He took her wrist carefully, his hand warm despite the cold. "I'm not going anywhere." She looked up at him, then slowly slid her arms around his waist. He let out a breath and pulled her in, his chin resting atop her head. Outside, the frost clung to the grass in silver outlines. Inside, the fire had burned down to embers, but the warmth between them held. Neither one spoke again. They didn't need to. The first snow came before the ground had hardened proper, wet and clinging, folding into the grass like a slow hush over the hills. Adele stood near the barn, watching flakes melt against the hem of her shawl as Garrett set a fresh rail along the paddock fence. The horses snorted in their stalls, restless from the cold air and the scent of weather shifting. "You ever trap before?" he asked, straightening from his work. She shook her head. "Only skinned rabbits Walter brought back. I never saw how they were caught." Garrett leaned the hammer against the fence post. "There's a line I used to run west of here. Some of the traps are still good. If the streams freeze, we'll need more than smoked venison." Adele brushed her hands together, breath clouding in front of her. "You'll show me." He gave a single nod. "You'll need boots thicker than those. I can stitch wool into the lining." He studied her feet, then glanced toward the barn. "There's an old pair of mine in the loft. Too tight for me now. Might suit you." She followed him inside, the smell of hay and horse sweat wrapping around them. He climbed the ladder, tossed the boots down. They thudded against the floorboards with a weight that made her smile despite herself. "They're awful," she said, slipping one on. "Better awful than frostbitten." She tested her balance, her toes barely grazing the end. "They'll do." That afternoon, they followed the creek west, snow thickening around their ankles. Garrett carried an oilskin bundle slung over one shoulder, traps inside wrapped in burlap to keep the scent down. Adele walked behind him, eyes scanning the banks for tracks. "Here," he said, crouching beside a bend where the ice hadn't formed fully. "Mink come through this way." You can tell by the drag mark's tail sways side to side. She knelt beside him, pressing her gloved hand into the snow. "How do you know it's not a fox?" "Fox keep their tails high. Mink drag. And they're curious, set a trap near moving water. You'll find them nosing around." She helped him place the trap, anchoring it beneath a flat stone. Her fingers were stiff, but her movements precise. When they stood again, the wind had picked up, blowing loose snow in spirals across the creek. "I like it out here," she said, adjusting her scarf. Garrett glanced toward her. "Why? It's quiet, the kind that doesn't feel empty." He didn't answer, but she caught the way his expression settled, like the wind had nudged something loose in him. They set 4 more traps before heading back, boots soaked through, cheeks flushed. That night, Adele rubbed lard into her hands by the fire, the skin cracked from cold. "You should have said something," Garrett murmured, watching her from the rocking chair. "I didn't want to stop." He stretched his legs toward the hearth. "You push yourself harder than anyone I've seen." She wrapped her hands in a cloth and sat beside him. "I spent years thinking I had to prove I was enough to keep around. That if I worked harder, Walter would." She stopped, eyes fixed on the flames. "But it was never about me." Garrett's voice was low. "No, it wasn't." They sat without speaking, the fire the only sound between them. After a while, Adele reached for his hand. He let her take it, their fingers warm with the nearness. The following week brought clearer skies and colder nights. On the 3rd morning, Garrett returned from the trapline with a mink and 2 weasels, all clean kills. Adele cleaned the hides behind the barn, her knife careful, practiced now. She didn't flinch at the blood, didn't wrinkle her nose at the smell. "You've got the hands for it," Garrett said, watching her from the porch. "Hands for what?" "Making something last." That evening, she brought out a quilt top she'd pieced together from the scraps she'd been saving: old shirts, flour sacks, the corner of a dress she'd worn the day he found her. She spread it across the floor beside the hearth. "It's not perfect," she said. Garrett crouched beside her, fingers brushing the seams. "Doesn't need to be." She sat back on her heels. "I think I want to stay here, not just through winter." He looked at her, eyes steady. "I'd like that." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It felt like something settling into place. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked. "I have," he said, "but only since you." She reached for his hand again, this time with both of hers. "Then let's build it, whatever it is." He leaned forward, forehead touching hers. "All right, Adele." The storm waited until morning to come. But when it did, they faced it together, firewood stacked high, traps checked, and the quilt laid across their bed. By late February, The snow had crusted into brittle layers that cracked underfoot, and the cold had settled into their bones like it meant to stay. The river was quiet beneath its frozen skin, and the hills wore a hush that only deep winter could bring. But inside the cabin, warmth lived in the small things: the sound of a kettle simmering, the scent of dried sage burning slow in a dish by the hearth, the soft creak of the rocking chair when Adele leaned forward to tie her boots. Garrett had built a lean-to off the barn, and they'd begun storing feed there to keep it dry. Adele helped shovel out the path each morning, her breath rising in pale ribbons as she worked beside him. There was no need for words in those hours. They moved in rhythm, familiar and easy. One morning she paused, leaning on the shovel. "I've been thinking about writing my aunt in Kansas," she said, not looking at him. "She thought I was dead, most likely. I haven't written her since before we left Missouri." Garrett straightened from where he was stacking kindling. "You want to go back?" "No," she said quickly, then softened. "But I want her to know I'm all right. She raised me after my mother passed. She deserves that much." He nodded. "You'll need paper." "I've got a few sheets left in the drawer by the stove." That evening, she sat at the table, pen in hand, candlelight flickering over her face as she wrote slowly, carefully, like each word had to fit just right. Garrett didn't watch. He kept to the fire, polishing the latch for the trapdoor they'd built into the root cellar, but he listened to the scratch of her pen, steady as snowfall. When she finished, she folded the letter and sealed it with wax they'd melted from the candle's stub. "I told her the truth," she said. "All of it." Garrett met her eyes. "Then she'll know how strong you are." Adele smiled, small and tired. "I told her about you too." He looked down, hands stilling. "What you say?" "That you saved me," she said. "But more than that, you stayed." He took her hand then, not hurried, just sure. "You stayed too." By March, the thaw began. The creek ran fierce and fast again, and the ground turned to mud where the snow gave way. Adele planted onion sets and early greens along the south-facing slope. Garrett repaired the porch rail where the winter winds had split the wood. The work was quiet and constant, and each night they returned to the cabin with soil under their nails and something like peace in their chests. One afternoon, while Garrett was oiling the hinges on the barn door, Adele came out carrying a folded cloth. She handed it to him without a word. He opened it carefully. Inside was a shirt, new, hand-stitched, the fabric plain but sturdy, buttons carved from bone. "I saved back some muslin from the trade," she said. "Figured you ought to have something that fits." He turned it in his hands, thumb brushing the seams. "You made this," she nodded. "Every stitch." Garrett looked at her, something in his chest pulling tight. "I've never had something made just for me," he said. "You do now." He reached for her, not quickly, just with the kind of certainty that comes when there's no more fear left to outrun. Their foreheads touched first, then their mouths, slow and sure, the kiss not rushed but rooted. That night, they sat together in bed beneath the quilt she'd finished before the year turned. The fire had burned low, and the wind outside had softened to a whisper. Garrett traced a slow line along her shoulder, then down to her wrist, as if learning her all over again. "You ever think about marriage?" he asked, voice low. Adele shifted to face him fully. "I used to. And now, I think I'd say yes," she said. He smiled, soft as the fading firelight. "Then I'll ask." He did, 2 days later, standing beside the creek where the water had begun singing again. She said yes, her hands warm in his. There were no rings, no preacher yet, but there was the promise, and for them, that was enough. They were married in April, under the cottonwoods, with Marshall Harlan officiating and Mrs. Burney from the Mercantile weeping behind a handkerchief. Adele wore a dress she'd sewn from unbleached cotton, and Garrett wore the shirt she'd made him. Boone was tied to the fence with a sprig of wild sage tucked into his bridle. Afterward, they served bread and sweet tea on the porch while late snow melted from the eaves. There was no music, but someone whistled a hymn, and Adele laughed when Garrett tried to dance with her in the dirt yard, boots slipping in the thawing mud. That night, when the last guest had gone and the fire burned low, Adele curled against Garrett beneath the quilt they now shared. "Do you ever think," she murmured, "how unlikely this was?" He pressed a kiss to her hair. "Every day. But we made it." He held her hand, their fingers threaded together. "We did. Years passed, but the rhythm stayed. The garden grew, the barn took on a second stall. Adele's aunt wrote back and came to visit once, her eyes full of tears and pride. Adele and Garrett cleared more land, built a small smokehouse, and traded pelts for a milk cow. They never left Pine Hollow, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't need to. Their life was not grand, but it was good. It was full. It was theirs. And every night, as the fire dimmed and the wind settled in the eaves, Adele would reach for Garrett's hand, and he'd give it without hesitation, like he always had. Like he always would.